So welcome back. This is UI5 2019 update course, and in this course we are going to start with SAP UI5, and the tool which we are going to use is full stack web ID. And to create the full stack web ID, first you have to log in to hana-trialondemand.com, and I will be logging with my ID. I go into new trial. In new trial, you will have the web ID freely available. So we will be using that full stack web ID. Go to service. Previously, there were cloud web ID and also full stack web ID. But now cloud web ID has been removed and we only have full stack web ID. Now we do have personal web ID, but the personal web ID has a lot of setup, which we have already covered in the previous section. If you want to use personal web ID, you can follow those videos, but in this section we will be only covering full stack web ID. We'll be covering other things with VS codes and other editors as well and IDs, but majorly we will be sticking with SAP full stack web ID in the cloud platform trial, which everyone can use. Okay, so let's go to the link here, which is go to service, and you have to keep this tab open. If you go in other tab and that tab is closed, then sometime the loading might take more time. So keep this tab loading and you will see that full stack web ID. Now the interface here is quite simple, and we will discuss about more of web ID full stack features, but over the time when we develop application, we will be creating that. So let me close all the things out here, and what I'm going to first do is I'm going to create a new workspace. Now what workspace will allow us to do? Workspace is going to allow us to create projects and artifacts inside the projects. So I will be creating a new workspace. So let's go to workspace manager here, and as you can see that we have two workspace already created, and I will be creating a new learn UI5. Okay, and let's create it. Now once I have this workspace, I just have to open the workspace in the current tab and open workspace. It will open the workspace in my current environment, and you can switch back to the previous workspace. Workspace are mostly to store your projects files at one point. So we are going into a new course, so let's have a new workspace. Previously the workspace were for BRF and workflow courses. Okay, so in here let's create a simple UI5 application to start with, and then we will go into the app structure of a UI5 application. So to create a UI5, either you can go into file, new, and you can use project from template. Now there are a couple of other options like a extension project, a sample application, or a quick starter with a layout editor, but we will be majorly using template. Now what this template does is it creates some default file with default value for the entire project, and mostly when you are creating a project from scratch, you will be using project from template. But if you have already an existing project, then you might be creating an extension project for that. So you create an extension project and you put your features there, or you can basically import it from wherever your application is. If your application is in your ECC systems, or your application is in your NetWeaver gateway system, or it's in the SAP cloud platform, you can import it from there if you have the existing application. But for now, I will be creating a new project from template. It's pretty simple. We have done it multiple times. The environment which we are going to use is new ABAP because we are in the new trial. More of this environment we have covered in SAP Cloud Platform. I will be keeping it strictly for UI5 application scope within this course. So if you have more questions about what is the environment, how can I build application in Cloud Foundry, so you have to go for our new ABAP on HANA course, and there we will be covering this topics. We will be touching some part of it, but not go in details. Okay, now based on my selection versions, I can make it all categories and I can see all the artifacts. This is a dashboard application. I have analytical application, CRUD, list report application, overview, Fury library. So a simple image is shown here on the right hand side, and it basically tells you how the application will look like. I'm going to create a application which is totally blank. It will have the first view and controller which will be created, but apart from that, it will only have a basic app structure from where you can start. Okay, so let's name this project my first UI5 app, and I have to give a namespace. Now maybe let's have UI5. So what this namespace does is that it separates your particular application functionally. So for example, if I have multiple functional fields in my company, I can have a financial field, a marketing field. So if I'm creating an application and I'm creating this application for material management, more like MM, then I can use the namespace of MM, which separates that application and categorize the application in that level. So over time, when I am maintaining the application, I know that, okay, which category this application belongs to. So namespace is a string literal, or more like a string, which is added before your project name to completely refer your application. What I'm saying by that, when I create the application, I will just explain it. For now, just take this into consideration that namespace is used to functionally separate the application. So let's go into template customization, and here the view type which I'm going to create is XML. I can create other views, JSON, JavaScript, HTML. JavaScript views I have created a lot in your 2016 UI5 professional development. Now majorly we are using XML to create the views. Now the name of the view is going to be app. The first view which you are going to create by default with this walkthrough template creator or template customization editor is going to be the root view. So the name should be either app or home or something which signifies that, okay, this is the root view. Not root, because normally root is used mostly in operating system, so the keyword might confuse you. So you use app or home, mostly that. Okay, so let's go to the next page and finish. Once I hit finish, then within few seconds I will get a blank application which will have a structure with me. So this is the app structure. Now if I go inside my web app, then I can see these are all the folder structure which are present in my application. So to run the application, I right click here and I say run and run configuration. Now run configuration basically will tell your SAP web ID that which is the file to run. So here I will add a run configuration, and here the file name which I need to select is /webapp/index.html. So mostly it is giving me or showing me all the .html files in the directory of my project. And now we are going to select this web app index.html, which is basically the starting point of application. Now the preview mode is the way how you see the application output. So you get a frame to set the device type, or you run the application without frame. So for now we are keeping it without frame, but we will in future also see how it looks with frame. Now there are other checkboxes like mock data and support assistant, but for now we will not be enabling them. And I can also add extra URL parameter here, and this parameter value can change how my application takes certain parameter of preloads. So these are something which we will discuss later on, but by adding few parameters in my URL, I can change how my application behaves. So I can do it with the URL parameters, but for now I'm not going to add it. Okay, so I will save it and run it, and what I will see here is a blank file, and I have my first view in there. So let's wait for it. It's going to take few seconds before you see that, and you can see that you have a title and a blank page. Now what we have done here, if you go into the app here, now the first thing I would like to show you is index page. In the index page here, now few of you might be wondering why I have this black background. Now I have changed that. If you go to the preference and you go to code editor, from here I have selected a different theme. So now you might be seeing the background as white. My background is basically gray and dark gray and black color, so it's much easier to focus for a long time. So it's your preference, just a extra feature. And if you want the font size to be bigger, then you can also do that from here, code editor, and save it. Okay, and if by default your preference is not reflecting here, then you can give the web ID a refresh, and it will be reflected back. Okay, now we have the index page. Now one thing which I want to show you here is the namespace which we added when we created the app, demo UI5, my first UI5 app. Now demo.ui5 is the namespace here, and when it is added with the app name, it creates a distinct name. For example, if I have a functional field called mm, and the app is managed order. Now you have the same app in maybe sales and distribution saying manage order. So if I am having a namespace in my company, like my company name, for example, if my company name is UI5CN, then I can say UI5CN.mm.manage order. So this is a different app. And if my other application of manage order is in SD, I can say UI5CN.SD.manage order. So it will be a different app. So based on your namespace, you can basically separate the app even if the app are having same names. So namespace is a mandatory field while creating the UI5 app. And namespace you will find in index.html and in manifest.json as well. Now this is when you open the manifest.json, you see this description editor, but mostly it's much easier to work with code editor, and you would be as a developer working with the code editor. If you are having initially challenges to understand the JSON, there are so many properties here, then don't be overwhelmed, because over time it will be much easier once you start understanding what is what. You can take help of description editor just to do some changes if something goes wrong in the code editor, but mostly we will be working with the code editor. I can right click and I can just go and open with the code editor also. If you are not getting that two tabs, sometime it happens, so that you can also do. Okay, so we have created a simple application. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into my view and see my root view. This is my root view. The root view is having a shell. The shell is containing the app, and the app is containing pages, and the pages is containing a page, and the title of the page is taken from I18N. So if I go into I18N here and I change the app title here, the title as Hello World, and save it, then if I refresh my application here, then the app title would be changed to Hello World. Now if I come back to my app view.xml, this is the XML view. Now the XML view which we have is automatically created. So here we have app controller.js inside a controller folder, and inside the view folder we have app view.js. These are automatically created, and most of the time, or almost all time, if you are creating the app for production use, then the first view and controller pair are your root view and controller pair. So what is the root, view, controller and pair, we will understand over time, but where they are actually defined, where am I saying that the app view and controller are the root, view and controller? So that is done in manifest.json. If you see manifest.json code, then if you scroll down here, or you can just search with root, here you have, but you can just search with root view and you will get it. So the root view is defined as the namespace, then the project, then the folder name and the view name, which is app. Okay, and this is the line of the code which makes your app as your root view and also instantiate it. So if you go into routes, you will also see that there is a route which has been created. So now when we talk about the routing helps our application to navigate to multiple pages. For example, if we run this application, we will navigate to the index page. If I want to navigate to a other page with some data, what I mean by that, if I try to run this application as a web application, and where I land here is in the first index page. Now if instead of going into index page, I want to go into second page. Now the second page we have not created yet, but what if I want to navigate to a view whose name is second view.xml. Now those configuration need to be done in this routing. So what happens, I can have a simple button in my application. When I click on this button, then I can navigate onto the second page. Now what happens here is the view, which is the root view, is instantiated. And what I mean by instantiation, now instantiation means the object of the view is created with controller. The views are always instantiated with the controller. So if I see all the methods here, you have the controller name attached to the view, and the view will typically be in XML, and in the XML structure you have the logic of how the UI element should be rendered if I try to render this particular view as an HTML page. So at the end of the entire UI5 application, we will be rendering this XML into HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And the component which I'm using, mostly you can see that I'm using page, and the page goes inside pages, and the pages goes inside app, and the app goes inside shell, and shell is what this view contains. So what happens is this entire view, when we try to instantiate it, would be converted into a object in the memory, and we render that object. Then whatever the component we use, accordingly the HTML will be created. For example, if we have used a page component, and based on the UI5 library, what is the meaning of page? A page will be a div. Inside of that you will have a container. So that particular HTML will be rendered. Now you don't have to really visualize that, because we can actually see that in action. If we go into this page, which is the application, I can go inside my element here, and what I will do is I will basically use this ID equal to app, and let me search it, or app. There are a lot of JavaScript which are linked, and there's a lot of JavaScript also which you will see in the header section, which are just because you are using web ID. So if you see here in the body, you have a class of SAP UI body, and the role is application. Inside that body we have a div, and the div name is data name demo my first app. Now this is the exact syntax which you will find if I go back to my web ID in the index.html in here, which is inside this. So this is the div which we are talking about, and this div will contain a ID equal to container, which is this one. So you have some data attributes here. We will talk about what is attributes, but for now just visualize this as our entire application will sit inside the body in the div here. So this div holds our entire application, and if we go into the element section here, then inside this particular div, if I close it, you will see that the entire application is closed. If I open it, then you will see that we have a container UI area, then you have my first UI5 app, inside which you have a container. I'm just reading the ID here, and inside the container you have a background. This is the background of the entire app. Then you have the shell bar and the central shell box. The box has a header, and the box also has the content which contains the app. And somewhere down the line here, you will see that the pages will be also added, and you can see that from the class attributes we have SAPM page enable scrolling, and somewhere down the line here you can see that we have SAPM page in the class. From the class I can identify that this div right here represent our entire page. So at the end of all this rendering, the view will be converted into your HTML, CSS code, and also JavaScript, which you cannot see in this element tab here, but it will be converted, and they will be rendered in the browser, because the browser will not be able to render any other thing apart from HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So the UI5 library is basically going to convert all the views into their respective HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And for now, what we have understood here is the manifest.json is the file which is responsible for initializing the application. Now, when we talk about the app structure, we also have one very important file which is component.js. Now, if I go into component.js, you will see that a very peculiar pattern which will be repeated again and again. Now, if we go into the pattern, let me copy this, and I will be opening a new editor here, which is in my VS Code. Now, you don't have to have VS Code. I'm using VS Code so I can work on the structure of this, and I don't want to really do it in web ID because then I will lose this simple application. So let me increase the size here, and what we have here is, if I see there is some array are there, so we have this array and we have this function. Let me remove everything else and just see the pattern. What is the pattern which we have? So this is also represented by this. This is not required. Yeah, so this is the pattern. So we are using SAPUI.define, and this is done inside the component.js. Now, similar to your component.js, the app controller structure is also similar because they formulate AMD pattern. Now, if we look into this, what it actually does, we have this SAPUI.define, which is the starting point. Now, the first argument it takes are dependencies, and the second argument is a function, and this function is going to return an object. So let me increase the size here, and that object is going to be component. Now, why we have this array here? Now, if I want to pass single value, I don't need an array. If I want to pass multiple value to this function, I will require an array. most of the time you will be passing dependency inside this function using your square bracket notation and signifying here array. For example, if I go back to my web ID, here I'm using demo UI5, my first application, model, models. So this is the location of the folder. Demo UI5 is my namespace. My first UI5 app is the name of the project, which is this. Then the model, which is this folder, and inside that we have models, which is this JS file. Now inside this JS file I see also a similar syntax. So if I want to have access to whatever value this particular model.js returns, then I will be using this particular path. So if I use this particular path, let me add it without double quotes, and I use model in my function, then the model.js, whatever it returns, I will have a instance of that model inside my function here. Now if you are not catching this, don't worry, because over time we will come back to it again and again, and you will see the same pattern repeating in every component, in every controller, and in everywhere, in even also when we define UI5 library. So this is called the AMD pattern, where we are passing the modules, and these are passed asynchronously. So where we are passing the dependencies. So these are called dependencies, and inside this function, whatever we are doing is private scope. Now more about public and private scope we have already seen in the JavaScript essential course. So you can refer to that if you want to learn about scope of this and that. I will highly recommend JavaScript essential course before starting with UI5 2019 update course. Now that is how any component in UI5 will be defined. You will be using this dependencies to inject, and inside the function you will catch it, and if you are using this model, then you can basically use this. For example, if I'm returning here, maybe let's see what we are returning. Let's go inside the app controller. We basically return here controller and extend. We are basically using the controller object, which is what we have here, and we are extending it. The first parameter is the namespace controller.app, and the second parameter is whatever the functionality we want to add in that particular controller. So SAP.UI core MVC controller is a particular class. Now if I go into open UI5, and you can go to SAPUI5 also, they are both the same thing. The only difference is that there will be certain new libraries and codes which will be present in SAPUI5. Okay, so SAPUI5 hana.ondemand.com, this is the API reference. I will be sticking with OpenUI5 because I want to show you a lot of open source code attached to SAPUI5 part. Okay, so when I go in here, SAPUI core MVC controller, let me go inside that. SAP.UI, that is how you navigate with .core .controller, and let me verify that core.mvc.controller. So here I have to write mvc.controller. So you can see that it has been denoted with a C. What C means is it's a class, and when I open, you can see here also this is a class. The N stand for a namespace and core stand for class. An actual definition exists in the class. Okay, Now in here, the SAP UI Core MVC will know actually how a controller should be created. Okay, and whenever we are creating a controller by extending SAP UI MVC controller, then in our application, in our UI5 application, the controller will be exactly what will be described here. Now what I mean by that, in a simple word, this is the class and I am just inheriting this class and I am passing all the functionality, because what I'm going to have inside here are, I can have other function, some custom function, and there will be a function, and then I have some lifecycle function, and there will be a lot of function inside this object. This is nothing but a object, and the object properties are basically functions. That's all, nothing difficult. It's just an object of functions. And what we are trying to do here is we are using the core MVC controller, passing this function, or when the controller is instantiated, it will be instantiated with our own functions. So if this is confusing to you, then don't worry, we will be coming back to it again and again. Fine, if you don't want to remember this, don't worry about it also, because you will be getting proficiency with it over time. Now that's how a simple AMD structure is constructed. The first thing is the dependency, and the second thing is the function which returns the object. That is all what you have to understand for now. Over time we will go into it again and again, so you get a good grasp of it. And in return, we might use the dependency or we might not use the dependency, and whatever we return, that becomes the name. For example, here we have component.js, and if I have something else, abc.js, which is the file name, then my abc.js will be whatever value I return. That is the object which the abc, or at this point here, component.js will represent. Now in UI5 application, the component.js is internally invoked just after the index.html. Now we will know more about what is the process of bootstrapping the application, which is, in a simple word, starting or loading all the library. Now we will be knowing about the process of bootstrapping the application, or in a simple word or term, loading the entire application over time or in the next consecutive sections. But first we are just familiarizing ourselves with the application structure. So for now we know that there is an index page and we have a manifest.json which basically holds all the initialization data for the application, and we have a component.js. Now the component.js is going to call the manifest.json, and this is the code for that, where you are calling the metadata property and assigning it to manifest.json. This is the point when your manifest.json is getting called. Now if I want to prove it, how will I do it? So if I come back here, now the init function is the first function which actually runs, and before the init function runs, we will be defining all the properties. So if I put a debugging point here, and if init function is the first function which runs, and here in my metadata tag I am calling manifest.json. So the question comes here is that init function is the first function to run, and the metadata might not be the first function to run. By the time we hit the debugging point, will I have all this property of my UI5 application loaded or not loaded? Now I have put a debugging point, let's verify that. So if I just refresh the application, there's some issue here, and that's the reason why I'm going to again run the application. And let me go to the inspect here, and I will refresh it again. So we stop at the debugging point. Now in the source tab, you will see that you stop here, and what I will do now, I will be basically using this pointer, and we all know in the previous JavaScript codes what this signifies. This basically points to the scope within this 2 curly bracket. So from line number, let me bring it to line number 9, from line number 9 to line number 30, whatever the scope is contained inside this. So if I do this dot meta, or there is a function called get metadata, I run it and I get some object in return. Let me say it m, which is metadata, and I say m dot get. There are a lot of functions which I see: get event, get libs, get models. So if I do get models, then I get the i18n models, and these are all the models which are already defined inside manifest.json in here. So that means that all the setting or metadata files have been already loaded to my application when I hit this debugging point. But init should be the first function to be encountered in a execution of the component. That is the lifecycle hook. So the answer to this is that whenever we are calling init, before that we are just going through the entire code. The program control will go through the entire code and try to define all the functions. Before the execution happens, the definition happens first, and this is at the time of definition when the manifest is loaded. So before starting any execution, the definition is done, and it is the definition when the manifest.json file is loaded. Sometimes you will find the entire manifest.json file or some part of the manifest.json file are present in component.js file as well. And the other thing which is done in the component.js file is enable the routes and enable the device model. Now more about the data binding and model we will discuss over time. So in this particular section, we understood how the manifest and component are laid out. We go to the next section where we are putting this all together in an overview fashion. So we get more concrete idea about how the structure of the application are put together and what is where. Okay, so let's overview this particular app. In the app, you can see there is a dist folder is there. For now, we don't talk about what is a dist folder. It is something which is created when we build the application for production. But for beginning level, let's try to avoid it or not discuss about it. The other details are inside the web app, we have a folder structure, and the main file from where the app start is the index.html file. Now the index.html file contains the library linking code. So basically it links to the entire library. Now when the libraries are loaded, we pass some of the properties, and this property basically controls how the library loads. For example, it can be that, okay, we need certain theme. The library should be loaded in an async way, so it doesn't take the entire library to load and then our application start, but the application starts when the library is still in the process of loading. And also we might control the version of the library which is loaded in our application. So those properties are passed within the index.html. We can also pass the same property in the URL, but in the index page, it is specified, or most of the time is specified in the index bootstrap phase. And we have in the index.html page the div. Mostly this div ID will be either content or it will be container. So what this div actually does is that this div actually stores the entire application inside of that particular div, and the entire application will be rendered in HTML5, CSS, and that is what is held inside this div, or that is what is contained inside div, which you see as UI5 application. Now the index.html, when the library will be called, the next important file which it invokes is component.js, and we have seen the AMD pattern, the structure of the component.js, which returns a UI component. For example, if I go into my app here, it returns a UI component, and this UI component is the object which the component.js returns, and that is the entire application initialization. And the component.js internally will be invoking also manifest.json, and this manifest.json will be having the model information of what are the data models which are to be linked in your app. It also have I18N, which is the property file which is used for binding different language in your application, and you have the version of the app and the library also defined in the manifest.json. And the most important part are your root view and also the routes, which are defined in manifest.json file. Now when we talk about routes, routes are not only used for navigation purpose. For example, I can navigate from view 1 to view 2 with routes, but also to instantiate all the views, we use routes. So that is one important thing which the routing does in our application. It instantiate all the view and controller in our application apart from your root view, because they will be added in the manifest.json where it is actually instantiated. Okay, so if you see the final app, we have an app, then the app contain pages, and the pages will contain a page, and the page will have an ID, and from the route we can navigate from page 1 to page 2 and from page 2 page 3. Okay, so that is how the routing will be carried out within the app. When I navigate to different pages, it basically goes and open that particular page in your HTML element. So if I go into my browser here, if I have multiple pages, then I will have multiple div which represent multiple pages. And whenever I navigate from page 1 to page 2, then the page 2 will be made visible and page 1 will be made hidden. If I come back to the page 1, then the page 2 will be made hidden and the page 1 will be made visible. So that's how actually internally this DOM manipulation is done by the library. So you don't have to worry about, all you have to worry about is how can you use the routes, and the routes internally are going to handle it for you. So this is the overview of entire application structure. And one of the important piece which we have to work as a UI5 developer is creation of the views and creation of the controller. Now views will tell you exactly how the UI elements will look like. So we'll be having charts or forms or some tables and all the functionality which this UI element will have. Like if the user interact with the chart, press somewhere, then what should happen? If some user enters the value in the form and put submit, what will happen? If the user see that table has some value and try to change the value, or try to navigate within the table, or open some closed field, then what should be then shown. So these functionalities are all put in the controller, and the view are basically holding only the UI elements, and a object of view and controller are instantiated. This is the root view and controller in the manifest.json, and all the other view and controller pair object will be instantiated with the help of the routes which you define in manifest.json. And all the page will have ID, and with this ID you can navigate to that page with routes. So this is the entire overall structure of the application. There are certain pieces which are still not covered, like models here, like test here. So we will be coming to this again and again, but we have gone pretty deep to cover the entire basic structure of a UI5 app. So let's go into the next section where we talk about Bootstrap process in more detail. Now we have looked in this section the app structure, but now the Bootstrap structure is also a very important part which need to be understood before we start working on application development, because we need to understand what libraries components are loaded and where they are present. So let's catch up in the next section to understand the Bootstrap process in more detail.